Dr. Martha Tepepa Covarrubias will be presenting on the shifting representations of the Maya. Um,
All
she
right.
has received her
Yes.
MA in Cultural Anthropology from Columbia University uh, in New York and her PhD in Urban Environmental Studies from El Colegio de Mexico, Mexico City. She's currently an adjunct professor of anthropology at Western Connecticut State University, and I hear that you are involved in some activism around the native Maya cultures. So please, everyone, give a hearty welcome to Dr. Martha Tepepa Covarrubias. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everybody. I am so grateful to be part of this exchange of ideas. And I come here to present you one that I hope resonates with you, given the current state of the world and what's going on in our countries. I would like to share my screen. Can I do that? Um, while I was working in this paper, many ideas came to mind. And while I was doing the research, a lot of themes, just embalmed to each other. And I had to decide to cut it short. So I think I've managed to make a very succinct argument and put together ideas that I hope I can share with you today. So I'm going to share with you my screen. Now, while I was, like I was telling you before, while I was writing this paper, I thought I wanted to talk to you about the perceptions of the global north regarding indigenous communities. But as I was, thinking and researching and pulling out articles and looking at my archives, I decided to shift a little bit the talk and talk to you about why images, why categorizations, why definitions matter, and why they have and how we discover that they are deeply rooted in our societies, especially in Abya Yala, for so many times. So before I continue, I want to make two notes here. When throughout this talk, I'll use the term Maya to refer to the 22 ethnic groups that are currently living in Guatemala, and also to the people that inhabit what is known today as Campeche, Chiapas, Quintana Roo, Tabasco, and Yucatan in Mexico. All of these ethnic groups have Maya ancestry. In this talk, I'm going to leave aside the Shinga and Garinufa ethnic groups that are also part of rural communities and emerged in these conflicts that I'm going to talk to you about. But since their historical and anthropological pathways are very different from the Maya, in this talk, I'm not going to talk about them. You will also note that I'm going to use the term Abya Yala to refer to Latin America, what is known as Latin America in contemporary social sciences. The term Abya Yala is a decolonizing epistemology that defines what people from the global north and mainstream social sciences have deemed as the American continent. Abya Yala has its origins in the Guna people who live in the Darien Gap, located in northwest Colombia and southeast Panama. For decolonization purposes, Abya Yala exemplifies what is fundamental for this work, an intimate and rather inseparable relation between body, place, and knowledge. So throughout this talk, I'm going to use that term. And if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, or we can always correspond by email. So while I was doing this talk, I wanted to divide my the periods that I'm going to talk to you about in two. I want to talk about, excuse me, I want to talk about two periods of time where I distinguish that how we define and identify indigenous populations matter. Let me just. Especially colonial times that start around the 1500s, and then the period that is known as La Violencia, which lasts about 35 years. It starts in 1940 and finishes in 1986. I'm going to refer to these two periods of time in Guatemalan history. And then I'm going to close my talk with a brief, and I hope positive, closing about the state of these shifting identities of the Maya today. To start the first period, it is important to note that this region where the Maya inhabited in Mesoamerican times comprehends what we call now Mexico, the south of Mexico, and all of these regions that are in the central part of Abya Yala. The modern states of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Belize, and a little bit of Panama. So my idea here is to tell you that the way people started thinking and imagining the Maya have a really, really deep root to colonial times, because it was under colonial times that the colonizers start defining who is what and what they are supposed to do. In my paper, I tell you that 200 years ago, when the Spanish people were occupying what we now call Guatemala, they set a pattern of society that is still used today. At the top of every country is an oligarchy of Hispanicized populations with European roots. Indigenous communities seldom or rarely, very rarely, have access to power structures. They are usually at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Not only, and as we know, not only are they oppressed politically and economically, but since colonial times have also been imposed this idea that they are not as good as the people that came from Europe. At the same time, for many centuries, academic and scientific production and studies of our civilization was usually undertaken primarily by global North voices, social scientists from European descent that came to these territories and explained to us who we were, what we were supposed to do, and where we were going. For centuries, all of these production was presented as a legitimate knowledge, not only to our students in our regions, but also throughout the world. So until the 1960s, you rarely ever found a thesis, or you rarely found a legitimate, what is called a legitimate publication done by an indigenous voice, let alone an African, Latin voice or Brazilian voice. It was always done by this type of people. Not only because there was obviously no financing in our countries to produce this knowledge, but also because the main sources of knowledge about our civilizations, about all of these great civilizations that according to their work had vanished, was also done in a way that was never mentioned that indigenous peoples were either depressed, discriminated against, oppressed, or living in poverty. Take, for example, and this is my first example, one of the first few of the first voices, and actually in Abya Yala, in Latin studies and history studies, we recognize that the first anthropologists in Abya Yala were actually missionaries, Spanish missionaries that sent the chronicles of the new discovered territories to the King of Spain. And what they did is that they sent these descriptions of the communities of the people that they found while they were exploring and conquering and occupying their territories. There is actually in history of art or art history classification of pictures of cased pictures. Colonial powers used these classifications, these categories, to establish rules and laws to control not only the land and the natural resources, but also to impose tributes and taxes that, in fact, now that we look at that, also denied opportunities to accumulate wealth or advance in a social structure to those that were deemed inferior. Why is this important? Because since cultural assimilation succeeded in our territories, these indigenous communities became or were named minorities, which is really, ironic since they were living in their own native territories. We can see this impact today. When you look at social policies, when you look at economic policies, you see that many of the definitions that are made of these vulnerable populations are made with that same kind of correct categorization. And you see it today when you do field work around in Abayala, around all of these different urban populations, you notice that very few people with indigenous ancestry openly identify with their heritage, choosing instead to highlight their white or Spanish identities. In the case of the Maya, and this is the contention of my presentation, is that during these two periods of times that I'm presenting to you, identifying as Maya was actually a matter of life or death, since assuming an identity that was Maya was actually lethal. Take, for example, in the colonies. The conquest of the Yucatan Peninsula that I showed you before took around 200 years. It was very slow and remained unfinished. While central Mexico was subdued by 1520s, the region of the Mayas took longer, not only because of the environment, but also because the Mayas were fighting and never really establish let the Spanish establish their cities. It was until 1524, more or less, that the city of Mérida in Mexico was founded, and it's only until around 1697 that the Spanish claim to have occupied what we know now as Guatemala. All of these historical records and anthropology, early anthropology records, are known because of the work of two bishops, Catholic bishops, that were established in Guatemala. One of them is Diego de Landa, and the other one is Bartolomé de las Casas. They both describe how the lives of all of the people that were inhabiting these new colonial cities was totally changed from the conquest, right? During the colonization time, the missionaries had the responsibility to convert all of these new populations into Catholicism. And they were able also to classify people not only by their race, but also by their origins in this stratified social system. At the very top of the colonial cities were only reserved for men that were born in Spain, what they call in Spanish, españoles peninsulares, and then also eventually the men that were born in the New Spain but had Spanish parents. So if your mother and your father were Spanish, then you were called criollo, and then you could probably assume a leadership post. At the bottom, at the very bottom, were the most of the native populations. And de Landa and de las Casas describe throughout their writings and the records, you notice and you can read how they considered that native populations were considered inferior to Europeans just because they were not Catholic and looked in a very different way from them. It should be pointed out that many times throughout the colonial times, in many writings and works of the colonial times, especially, for example, in Las Leyes de Indias, most of the responsibilities and duties that were imposed were done through a kind of slavery system called la encomienda. Although it's not, how do you say, directly referred to as slavery, it is kind of a slavery. When you read the encomienda legal status, you see that it is basically granting to Spanish people, granting Maya adults, women and men that are assigned or granted to the Spanish encomendero to perform unpaid labor, while the children are sent to school that are managed by the Catholic Church, where they are supposed to learn Spanish and religion. Seldom or very few, if ever, Maya students, or close to none actually, were ever sent to work in universities or to learn something rather than hard work. Most of the children, as they grew, work in workshops or were apprentices or work as housekeepers. It is then, and we can point out that this is during this time when indigenous families started encouraging children to speak only Spanish and are pushed to wear only Western clothing because of this harsh violence, ideological pressure, and terror that was inflicted during these times by Spanish institutions like the Inquisition. The Inquisition, as you might know, is a procedure in which the Catholic Church had the right and, as they say, the responsibility to judge and put basically to death people that did not abide to the Catholic Church. So during that time, that is my contention, during that time, identifying as an indigenous person was considered very harmful during that time. The other time that I referred to in my paper comes in 1940s, 1960s. And for that, I wanted to show you an article that was published in Life magazine in the United States in the 1940s. It's an article written by Professor Morley, August. What's his full name is Silvanus Griswold Morley, and he's in charge of writing this spread in Life magazine. At that time, Professor Silvanus Griswold Morley was leading the world expert in Maya hieroglyphic writing, and he was basically the public face of Maya studies for more than 40 years. As you read the article, you see that Morley defines the classic periods of archaeology, of Maya archaeology, and he goes through all the stages until at the very end, he talks about the modern Maya. He states that the Maya were the greatest native civilization of the New World and that they were isolated and unknown to the nations of Europe and Asia, and I'm reading here, to the primitive Indians of the North. Not even tribesmen from neighboring lands dared to penetrate tangled jungles of Guatemala or the Yucatan Peninsula. In the screen, you're looking at a picture of Professor Morley in Yucatan. And in the bottom, you see some, the front page of Life magazine, and also some pictures that were taken by Dimitri Kessel, both of European descent, right? Professor Silvanus, an American man, and Dimitri Kessel, a German that emigrated to the United States. Yeah, it's 1940s, and you see the romanticized view of the Maya as a great civilization that suddenly abandoned their wonderful cities. And in the article, they write how their descendants, the descendants of the Maya, are superstitious and resistant to change. In page 63, and I'm reading from Life magazine, you read that Professor Morley says that the men are farmers, not different from the old and new empires. The modern Maya have resisted change. He has borrowed a few items from the white man's civilization, trucks, tools, even radios. But his way of life still reflects, though dimly, the patterns of the great culture that has vanished. This, in fact, was the view of the Maya in the 1940s. Right there in the screen, you can see the picture that Dimitri Kessel takes of a Maya family. And you see how Professor Morley also writes about the way that he sees Maya peasants, right? In that. Now, this wouldn't be a big deal unless I also have to share with you that it is during that time, the 1940s, when the United States has a big role in Abya Yala. I contend that my second period that I want to share with you right here, my second period of La Violencia starts more or less in that time, 1940s. Just a side note, it was in today, in the 1950s when the Cuban Revolution explodes in the Caribbean. And it is then in the 1940s when you have the starting of the Monroe Doctrine that was used by the US to intervene at the beginning of the Cold War, intervene potential communist states throughout the world. My contention is that the period of La Violencia in Guatemala started with a military coup backed by the United States that overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. Since then, for 3 decades almost, Guatemala experienced a deadly and very bloody civil war that turned into internal armed and intellectual even conflicts. These conflicts put together and confronted not only military regimes and guerrillas of that time, but also intellectuals. Many leading social scientists fled to Europe or to the United States or to Mexico. And the ones that stayed became not only supporters of these military regimes, but also did a lot of work that is now questioned because their work was based in a now very criticized theory known as eugenics that was used by the militaries in Guatemala to categorize Maya people as subversive and label them as communists. People that were Mayas were target of military attacks aimed to physically eliminate entire communities in the rural areas of Guatemala. The end results of this internal armed conflict, according to a commission that was established in 1994, was the forced displacement of about 1.5 million indigenous peoples from their native territories, the disappearance of more than 40,000 people, and the blunt and clear assassination of more than 200,000 individuals. We're never going to know the extension of these crimes against humanity because the same people that were putting to trial the people that committed the atrocities were the same militaries that eventually became president. The UN now recognizes that during this time of La Violencia, there were the Guatemalan military committed acts of genocide against the Maya peoples. One of the contentions of decolonization academics is that not only many anthropologists, sociologists, and social scientists from the global north remained silent, they did very few actions to protect Maya indigenous peoples. In another contention here is that it was the work of many eugenic physical anthropologists like Maurice Sterhira, the ones that contributed their work to support not only the US intervention, but also the actions of the Guatemalan state. You can see today, in 2024, the legacy of violence that has been permeated since then in Guatemala. Even if the signing of the peace accords in 1996 gave the whole region a moment of peace, it also transformed our countries into neoliberal economic programs that conceded a lot of territories to transnational government. In fact, President Jacobo Arbenz was thrown out because he had implemented an agrarian reform that was going to hurt US transnational companies, banana companies. So while he was going to be thrown out, they put in, since then, the United States backed a series of regimes that not only conceded all sorts of, facilities to US transnational corporations to exploit and occupy indigenous territories, but they also thrown Guatemala economy into one of the most poor countries in the world today. The periods that I presented you in this paper and their historical context, those two, we believe are the pillars of the decolonizing efforts of contemporary social scientists. Indigenous Maya intellectuals that returned to Guatemala at the beginning of the year 2000, more or less, coinciding with the Zapatista rebellion in 1994 in Mexico. Since then, they have been trying to rescue and repossess and retake their own history. Anthropologists, lawyers, historians, political scientists, sociologists, and lawyers in what we call this pan-Mayanist movement have been working to not only reappropriate, but also retell the story of what happened during these violencia times, and also try to define and reconsider what can be considered, right, of those early global north work that depicted Maya people as inferior. So what we're trying to do is to put together all of these pieces and tell a story that not only validates, but also dignifies the diverse Maya identities and experiences that are today very well alive, and challenge these colonial legacies of categorization and definition of Maya people. Many research today demonstrates how these legal and category assumptions about expertise and sociological anthropology, or whatever social science you want to talk about, complicate and try to hinder the participation and the recognition of indigenous actors in the creation of knowledge. How this also affects the way we view indigenous peoples at the popular level. I get a lot of optimism, by the way, when I see contemporary artists. For example, in my screen, I'm showing you two indigenous actors that proclaim themselves and identify as Maya, and two actors that have been featured in Hollywood movies. In your screen, you're looking at Maria Mercedes Coroy and Josue Maichi. Both were actors in this movie, Wakanda Forever. In fact, that movie even contains contemporary rap Pat Boy music, which fills our hopes with our hearts with hope and how do you say, positive ideas for the future. We think in decolonizing all of these knowledge, it's also very important to provide indigenous intellectuals and academics not only the necessary funds and institutional research space to do research, but also spaces to share our ideas and talk about and rescue and present ideas that are not necessarily part of mainstream academic syllabus, but also creating a condition for dialogue between native intellectuals and also global north intellectuals. Uh, in popular culture, like I told you, we see now more people that identify as Maya or indigenous in many realms, in media, in the music, in the literature. There is still a long way to go. We recognize that, of 250 films that were done in Mexico, for example, not even 12% are even centered in indigenous or Afro-Mexican characters or storylines. In fact, it's a very, very tiny fraction. But along this track of representation, it's also, how do you say, very disheartening to see the racism that is in daily life, right? 3/4 of people aged 12 and up say that indigenous people are still very valued very little in our communities. So in this paper, I'm trying to present to you that how we define indigenous people have a colonial connotation that we still haven't been able to shake out. I will share the paper with the conference participants, and I thank you very much for listening to me, and I'm here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Marta. That was really fascinating. I think it's a story that a lot of people who live in colonized areas have forgotten, right? Deliberately, it's been erased. And one thing I wanted to ask you to maybe elaborate on a little is the the way in which the victor's writing history, as it were, shapes the reality of the people who are erased. I mean, there's so much there, but I'm really interested in this in the sort of the deliberateness of this narrative because so many people um, here in North America, also known as Turtle Island, and also in I'm sorry, I did not catch the name that you called Latin America. Um, but all throughout the Americas, especially, and certainly other colonized parts of the world, there's this perception that indigenous peoples no longer exist, that they died out. And that's simply not the case. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the narrative crafting there and what effect that has.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with you. And let's also, we can. I could how do you say, respond in so many ways, but just in a very relevant way today, since you see that in these how do you say, talks and discussions of climate change, indigenous peoples have been very, very vocal about how the environment is being decimated, right? In Abya Yala, that's the term. That's the term. Abya Yala. In Abya Yala, you have a lot of transnational corporations that today are facing trials put up together by those that were defeated, right? The indigenous peoples. You have Chevron, a trial in Ecuador against Chevron because of the decimation of the Amazon in Ecuador. And that trial was won. Now, the Supreme Court in this country just a week ago decided to get rid of that is called the Chevron rule. They totally suspended the Chevron rule, and like that, the winners take it all again, right? So it is important. It is important to define and for legal procedures to erase those identities. Why? Because erasing the identity is the easiest and most legitimate way to extract possession, right? So since you don't live here, since you never existed, this is not yours. Remember that private property was something brought by the colonizing powers. They decided this is mine, and people didn't realize, indigenous people didn't realize, what does that mean? Well, you still see it today. That cultural establishment, that property invention of the colonial powers has repercussions to this day, 2024. 500 years later, we are still going through all of these problems. Who is accountable for the pollution of? Who is accountable for the cancer, the water safety in our territories? Not us, right? So it is important to see that, yes, the winners keep winning, and the people are going to keep losing until we put together our efforts. It's taking very long, and it's going to take a lot of time because we're playing again under the winners rules. But
Right.
it is taking time, and you see the harm that it has done to many populations, especially around, well, in this country, right? You see all of the treaties that were signed by the colonial powers and were not complied, pushed away, and eventually just, how do you say, eliminated, right?
Yes. Fully voided just by dint of ignoring them.
Exactly.
And there are so many places where that colonialism is ongoing, like the current occupation of Hawaii.
Yes,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, so we here at SASA really believe that connecting the past to the present has a very positive effect on how people understand each other. And I think this is one of those great examples where people don't even know how much they don't know. Um, so so I guess my next sort of direction of question is, how does the modern Mayan, as it were, relate to the pre-Columbian past? Before we had these colonizers, how much can we tease out there?
Oh, well, that is one of the most amazing, how do you say, aspects of Pan-Mayanism. You have a lot of intellectuals today creating not only art, but also knowledge, not rescuing per se what the pre-Columbian people do, but just using it as a base to diffuse, to expand and to share this knowledge with other people. For us, it's actually from people from Abya Yala. It blows our minds that many students in the global north don't even know about, the little tiny revolutions that happened while the colony was happening. For example, in the Maya territories, students are not taught, for example, that throughout the regime of Spain in our territories, there were so many revolts against them, but those they don't tell. You see, those things are not told. They are not shared with students. So one of the things that these new intellectuals are doing is going back into, and it's ironic because the Spanish have the records of these. All of the revolts that happened, for example, in the in colonial times and pre-colonial times, were shared with the Spanish missionaries. The Spanish missionaries, remember, their job was to send reports to the King of Spain with all of the knowledge that they extracted from the conquered communities. So it is really interesting to see that many colleagues, many Maya colleagues, are now traveling back to Spain to look at the royal archives to put together the narrative, the historical narrative of what happened then. And this always blows my mind. If when you talk to some of the Maya colleagues, they tell you, my grandpa used to talk about my whatever that was in that war, and we don't know about it. So now I'm working on it and I'm going to rescue this. So it is just so, it fills me with great joy that you have intellectuals like this that go back, ironically, right, to Spain to try to collect all of the stories that are there written by Spanish missionaries about their families, about their ancestors that fought in whatever war. So it is really interesting. And these are processes that take very long. This is not something that can be done quick, right? In the digital era today, we are used to getting things fast. No, this is going to be a long process of reconciliation, of rescuing and digging deep to see what is that knowledge that we can put together ourselves about our history, about ancestry, right? But it is a process, and I think we are slowly getting there. Technology also offers amazing resources to do this. So, I'm confident, and and I also trust the students, like, probably this group, students that, are interested in this. They don't assume and don't restrict their view. They look and they are inquisitive and they want to know. So if we are able to shake them and present them an alternative view, that is, I think, also the future of this effort to rescue, what was tried to be eliminated.
Yeah, I've got a question in chat about sort of the difference between um sort of the way that the Maya areas were colonized and the way that a lot of the sort of the Turtle Island areas were colonized in terms of treaty and land grants and stuff. Um, I've heard that there's a lot less of the even the initial treaty grants
Right?
when it comes to the more Abya Yala area.
Yes. Yeah. What the biggest difference between Abya Yala, in pre-colonial times, we've defined three main cultural areas: oasis, meso, and arid. And the three first words define, basically, remember, people that inhabited Abya Yala were very directed by the environment. So the first, meso, refers to the meseta, which is Mesoamerica. They call it
Mm.
Mesoamerica. So it's the first cultural region, which encompasses the south of the United States, all Mexico, and parts of the Maya. This area was able to be colonized and occupied by the Spanish people. And this is probably going to sound very simplistic, but I believe that this is a very good way of explaining to students. This area was easier to be colonized because the weather wasn't so oppressive. Remember, imagine yourself, these are European people used to a certain way of living, used to a certain environment, a certain weather, a certain way of life with mountains. Just put yourself during that time, 1500s. And then think about the environment that was up there in these areas. At the north of Mexico, you have the United States, a lot of desert, a lot of, the Midwest of the United States, a lot of mountains and kind of cold. And then to the very, very bottom of Mexico, throughout the peninsula of Yucatan, you have this jungle. It's a jungle from South Mexico all the way to the Darien. That's a jungle. So imagine the oppressive temperatures. A lot of archaeologists and anthropologists in Abya Yala have defined that it was because of these how do you say, unprepared,
Inhospitable.
for them,
Oh,
right?
for
Yeah, and
them
also for them
to be so unprepared.
to be so unprepared. The other thing, the second thing why it was so different is because remember, well, and I'm sure many of you know that there was a virus that Europeans brought. So a lot of the population in this area, in the central areas, were decimated because of the sarampion. How do you say smallpox? There was a
Smallpox.
smallpox pandemic, and a lot of the indigenous peoples, which were never didn't have the immunity to smallpox, died. So a lot of the indigenous communities in this area died. And that's why this area was able, Mesoamerica they were able to conquer that faster. The Maya, on the other hand, were in the middle of the jungle. So it took them seriously 200 years to be able to establish the cities. The heat, the animals, remember there were jaguars, there were a lot of animals there, and there also the mosquitoes and all the fauna that Europeans were never familiar with. At the north, you had communities that were always moving around because they heard the buffalo, right? So they were moving around, and they also dealt with another type of conqueror. The English were really, and well, and not only the English, but the Dutch that preceded the English believed in trade. So they established, and that's where all of these pacts and treaties and whatever root from. Whereas the
As
Spanish
opposed to
came
the conquistadores, right?
exactly, because remember, the Spanish had this idea of conquering for their Spanish king, yes, but also were deeply religious. So you have everything in the name of the Catholic Church. In fact, the Catholic Church was a super powerful player in these areas, whereas in the north, the church was never, ever, ever important because of the nature of the occupation from the Protestant people, right? That they were kicked out of their Europe and came here to this area to establish a more, how do you say, open society. So that's why they were more open to play this game of treaties. Whereas in Spain, they were there to claim the land, convert everybody to Catholicism, and present the King of Spain, Queen, and then their land, their newfound land. That's, in my opinion, the main difference. One, Catholicism, and two, the nature, just the nature of the environment and the nature of the occupation.
Yeah. And Christianity did play a big part
Oh,
in
yes.
in everywhere in the colonies. But the Catholic Church's iron grip is certainly a factor that the Protestants did not have
Mm-mm.
backing them. But the idea
No,
of missionaries is inherently a
totally.
a colonial idea. And it's interesting when you go around places like Portugal and you see these monuments to missionary colonization that they're still revered, right?
No, yes.
People have not deconstructed that at all.
No,
Um,
not even throughout Abya Yala. In Mexico, in central Mexico, you still have, well,
mhm.
recently they got rid of the statue of Christopher Columbus, but you also have many provinces in Mexico that still have the status of those. In Merida,
Mhm.
Yucatan, you still, and I don't know if they throw it, they put it out, but they still had the two huge statues to the Montejos, and in Guatemala to Pedro de Alvarado. Those men that the priests, the missionaries that I mentioned in my talk, Diego de Landa, Bartolomé Las Casas, wrote that they were cruel men that did all sorts of unspeakable, un-Catholic, whatever actions against children, women, and men. I mean, they
Mhm.
were brutal, and they still have those statues there, you know?
Yeah, we still have Columbus Day in the US,
Yeah,
although there is a huge and growing movement to replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day.
right?
But it still exists, even though Columbus was acknowledged even by the Spanish
Yes,
as a horrible person who
yes,
who just committed
yes,
atrocious acts.
yes.
Nobody wanted to follow him.
No.
Um, so to bring this back around, I'm really interested in coming back to this idea of ownership and environment. This sense of existing as part of the world that seems to be very common in indigenous cultures, particularly indigenous to the various Americas, to 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 use a colonizer phrase. But what else do we have sometimes? Um, so you mentioned a couple of times like the a lot of the indigenous societies didn't really consider themselves owners of the land. You mentioned nomadic tribes, you
Right.
mentioned people who live among the jungle fauna and interact with that. There were cities, certainly, although they have often been disregarded by white
Yeah.
historians. You were pointing out the scholar who was like the face of hieroglyphic studies for a long time, and just oof, just oof. I don't have
Right.
any other words for it right now. Um, but but there is this ongoing present movement driven by that connection to the land that isn't about possession. And there are a lot of indigenous faces at the forefront of water conservation and land preservation movements. And I wonder if you can speak about how that connects to that history.
Yeah. I mean, aside from the fact that we have to realize that property was a colonial figure, a construction of colonial powers, we also have to recall and remember that many of these communities that existed before colonial times also had a very intrinsic relation with nature. Unfortunately, right, we don't have the records to show it because they were destroyed. In the case of the Maya, it's funny that Diego de Landa, the same person that records everything and sends it back to Spain, was the person that put in a fire all of the Maya codex, all of the so-called books that the Maya had been keeping about their own history and the history that they recorded, astronomy, mathematical, medicine, uh, music, singing, dancing, all of those records were destroyed in a big fire that De Landa put because these were considered, remember, Catholic Church, satanic rituals, whatever. Also, one thing to have and keep in mind is that we're never going to be able, ever, students and humanity, to know what exactly happened because all of the knowledge that was passed to these missionaries was interpreted by that missionary, a European man that came from Spain under Catholic religion. So just bear that in mind, right? Another thing is that all what we know about religious practices of the Maya also comes from the people that survived the conquest. In every conquest, and the Spanish write this about this, the first people to go are the royalty, right? The leaders of those. The seconds to go, intellectuals. So all of the brilliant minds of indigenous Mexica Empire, Maya empires, all of those guys were gone. So you only get the records from the people that were not even involved in that. So those are three things to keep in mind. So how do we solve this puzzle? Well, archaeology. Archaeology. We have archaeological records today that show the astronomical knowledge of the Maya. We have, thanks to science and technology today, we are able to see how the Maya were ahead of their time in astronomical, mathematical, geographical, even knowledge of the world that they inhabited. We're never going to know how they used plants. The only record that we have is from what people told and told and told through the centuries to their descendants. So that's another thing. But what we can also be sure of is that there was a understanding of indigenous peoples in what we now call the Americas, Abya Yala, not only of how the astronomy worked, but also how the seasons worked. Our agricultural techniques in this region are amazing. Take the system of cultivation of central Mexico, very ingenious, very full of knowledge, combining three basic, and I think they also do it here in North America, right? The
Yeah, the
Three
Three
Sisters.
Sisters.
Right. And it comes from the same, when you analyze the same principle is, repeats in every single community from the north of Abya all the way to the south. The same way of preserving, seeds, the same way of spreading, the same way of taking care of the rivers, of rotating crops, right? All through natural and again, in that time, there were no pesticides, right? So using your environment to see these. And this is something that was really lost in the United States, because in the United States, this indigenous knowledge has been just eliminated. You don't have the knowledge of ingredients, indigenous ingredients, because people don't use them to cook, which you do in Abya Yala. In South Abya Yala, you have it in Mexico, what we now call Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador, Honduras, El Salvador. You do have this knowledge. So I think some of the knowledge remained because of the memories of our ancestors, and also because some of the environment that has not been so destroyed, right, comes back, and you can tell that there are some richness, right, that comes back through time. Right now, again, we are at, and on the other hand, this would be again, I don't want to sound romanticized and not realistic. We are facing really horrible conditions right now throughout Abya Yala, not only because of the oppression and repression of environmentalists, so many environmentalists that have been killed throughout the region. You also have the presence of criminal gangs all over those nature, really, how do you say, rich nature environments. It's not only drug dealers, but it's also mining operations that are illegal. The deforestation that it's
Yeah,
also
for
illegal. Exactly.
cattle and mass crops.
Exactly. So I'm not trying to sound super optimistic. No, there are dire challenges. And again, the completely disregard for human and animal lives in exchange of profits, because at the end, that's what it all is about, money. So yeah,
I completely agree. And I think that indigenous knowledge is it's a blessing that it hasn't been fully destroyed.
oh,
Uh,
totally. Yes. No,
Thank you so much
yes.
for being a part of bringing that knowledge back to the forefront, of bringing antiquity forward in that way. We are about out of time. Thank you so much. This was such an enlightening talk. I really enjoyed it. Um, what lovely images you have brought to us, and what terrible ones as well.
Right? Yeah. Well, knowledge is like that. And I think through our academic careers, you're going to be able to see the good and the really hopeful ideas that we have. But we also see the bad. And that bad should not make us feel, how do you say, sad? Well, you might feel sad, but let's not lose,
Discouraged.
yeah, discouraged. Let's not be discouraged. Let's, put together our hearts and our minds. And I think another future is possible. We can do this. We will do this.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Marta Covarrubias. We thank you so much for your contribution to this conference. Really wonderful talk. Uh, very lovely having you. And thank you, chat, for your thoughtful questions. We did have several that came up there. And I really admire uh, your ability to speak to such a broad topic that is becoming even ever more important as our environment takes back what it's owed. Um, so thank you very much, and it has been an absolute pleasure to have you aboard.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for the space. Thank you.
Thank you.